So, like, what y'all find interesting about the article?
Yeah, well, I'm assuming because it says here are some questions.
I mean, it was cool. It was all right.
If we just ask them.
I thought it was kind of weird how long they took data for, because it was like over 10 years, I think. But
Personally, I think it increased.
I agree with what Cody said. And I also think that it was interesting how the population of the humans on the island went up so much. Because I didn't really know that there were humans there at all before reading the article. And so it's interesting to see how they impacted how the birds evolved over time.
You guys want to talk about the questions on Moodle?
yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so the first one is, what was Hendry's big picture question, and what types of human impacts on biodiversity were there? Did they decrease or increase biodiversity?
I think that
And then
the reduction of diversity.
And the next question is, which one gets the most attention? So yeah, what do you think the big overall question was, I guess? I think it was, do human activities smooth adaptive landscapes and increase hybrid fitness? It's kind of their hypothesis. I think that's probably what they're hitting at, is how humans affect the finch population on the Santa Cruz.
Okay, so I'll just interject in here and then I'll pop out of your room. You just read something that was in the abstract. What does that mean, to smooth an adaptive landscape? And you guys discuss that amongst yourself after I'm gone.
Okay.
Okay. So do we think that that they focused on either the species diversifying more or converging more? Does that make sense? I don't know.
I think it focused mostly on diversifying, because they touched on how the human population is starting to grow rather rapidly. And like I said previously, I think it gives an excuse for finches who would usually stay on some parts of the island to go outside of their feeding range, I guess. And that could lead to more diversity within the finches.
Okay. So why did they choose this particular system to try to answer their question? So by the system, they're talking about the Galapagos Islands.
I think that they probably chose that specific species just because it had so much variance, with the beaks. And then they had a couple of different locations that they had different situations happening that they could study.
Yeah, different niches and stuff like that too as well. Came a long way, so they were able to test more. And it was along with what Daniel was saying, they had diverse, more diverse birds that they could test to as well. So I feel like that's the reason why they chose it as well.
So what would be the niche dimension that they're most interested in here? So remember that the niche can be this multidimensional hypervolume of needs and requirements. What would be the dimension that they're looking at from the perspective of the bird?
So the food resources?
Yeah, so they're basically because they're looking at the beak. The beak, as they talked about in the introduction, is related to the type of food that they're capable of eating, and so that would be the niche dimension that is essentially being targeted by selection in this system.
So, what does the term bimodal mean? I thought bimodal meant like diversity within a species. That's kind of how I interpreted it. Like how the finches all originated from like that one species of finch, and then it's split off down. I think they said.
It's just, are the people in your group still talking now? Mine just.
Yeah. How did you guys interpret that?
I mean, I didn't know what it meant going, so I just, picked up. I don't know. Yeah, but I found out that it meant the same thing that you were kind of saying.
So
yeah, it's just that, like.
Go ahead, Elena.
It's like the population split, so there was like a peak of amount of like the larger beaked and then the smaller beaked, and not many of the intermediate size.
Yeah, so is there a place in the paper where you can go and see what a bimodal distribution looks like?
I have those graphs in the paper. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So they show you some bimodal distributions, and they actually point with an arrow to the section where the valley is that separates the two modes. Why would that be important for them to, they make a point of mentioning this bimodality at Academy Bay back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Why is bimodality important in this paper?
To see like how it changed from that time, maybe.
Okay, so what is a bimodal distribution indicative of? What does it indicate might be happening in that population?
Well, they're testing to see how like human interaction in population changes biomodality. So if that kind of answers the question, I don't know if I fully answered that.
Well, so that's what they're looking at as a signal, but it's a signal of this deeper thing, this more important thing from their perspective.
Is it just how like the humans have influenced like the natural selection of the species?
Okay, so if you have a bimodal distribution of finches in terms of their finch beaks, what's happening to that population?
Well, bimodal, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's like referring to their differences, right? Like the largest size beak and the smallest size beak. So if it was continuing to get more and more bimodal, it'd be continuing to like narrow that valley in between the large and small beaks.
So this is what the bimodal distribution looks like. This is a bimodal distribution. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So what does that indicate is happening with these birds? What is the Galapagos Islands famous for?
How many species of finches and stuff they have there?
Yeah, so it's famous for the creation of new species. So you have these 14 different species of finches that presumably all came from a single colonist way back, 4 million years ago. So why is bimodality important to Hendry and his colleagues?
Is it maybe showing how like this might be like the start of it forming two new species by its
Yeah, exactly. So this would be indicative of what we refer to as disruptive selection. And disruptive selection just refers to situations where selection favors individuals at the extremes of a distribution rather than some other portion of the distribution. And these individuals in the middle have a lower fitness, and that basically drives these two populations, these two subsets of the population apart. When they get far enough apart, they then begin to not feed on the same food, which means they might not hang out in the same place, which means they start to go off on their own evolutionary trajectories, ultimately, in this case, turning into two new species. And then, of course, what do they think is happening as a result of humans being there?
We're not allowing them to separate.
Yeah, and so the idea is that the presence of humans is taking that bimodality away, meaning that rather than selective pressures pushing them apart, it's actually allowing them to kind of coalesce and come back together, which then slows down the rate of speciation in this case. So when you talk about on the first question, what are the effects of humans on animal diversity? Well, one thing that can happen is, of course, you can just drive species to extinction. But in this case, they're thinking about, well, can humans actually slow down the formation of new species such that there aren't new species being formed, all at the same time that we're also driving other species to extinction? So that's kind of the gist of it. I'm going to leave you guys and go lurk someplace else.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All of you guys have your mutes on. You can just unmute yourself. There's just 5 of you here.
I have a lawnmower or something running outside my window.
Oh, do you? Okay. All right. Then you can stay muted, but what about the rest of you?
Are we going to have a competition to see who can come up with the most concise hypothesis that they had? Or?
No, I just want you to drill down and get at kind of the heart of it. But is that where you guys are at?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the questions. We just went down a little bit. And the hypothesis we came up with was basically that bimodality correlates negatively with human impact.
Okay, can you put that in language that your grandmother would understand?
Yeah, so when human impact increases, bimodality decreases. And
okay, my grandmother doesn't know what bimodality is.
When human impact increases, species variation decreases.
Okay, and why somebody else? Why would Hendry and his colleagues care about that?
Oh, we as humans don't have to, or we can be mindful for species and not negatively impact them.
Okay, so what do you mean by negative impacts?
If we are a harm to the species as a whole or population as a whole.
Okay, so what particular harm are they thinking of when they write this introduction?
The evolution side of it.
Okay, so they're thinking about diversity. When we talk about species diversity, what do we mean?
The different traits within species.
And that's not what species diversity is. You guys have a textbook. Can you guys look up what the definition of species diversity is? We talked about this some in the Galapagos introduction also.
I found it.
Yeah.
It's measurement that relates number and relative abundance of species with community.
Okay, so when we talk about species diversity, we're talking about how many species are there and how evenly distributed individuals are across those species categories. So this takes us then back to the question I had a minute ago. Why does this bimodality relate back to that particular issue of species diversity?
Because when the bimodality went away, because more people showed up, there was less species diversity.
Okay, so ask yourself, are these two modes in this distribution, are they species yet, or are they just sections of a population going to become species?
Sections of a population.
Okay, so there's subsets of a population on their way to become species. So the first question, it sounds like you might not have grappled with the first question in a list of questions very well. So go back and revisit that first question about what their big picture question is, what they're talking about in terms of what do humans generally do to diversity, and what are the different ways in which humans can do this to diversity, because it sounds like maybe you need to revisit that a little bit. And I'm going to go lark on somebody else's group. Nathan, I thought I moved you to a new room.
Let me see if I had a notification or something. Hidden behind another window.
I don't know.
No,
Breakout
I don't
room.
think so.
Nathan Judd, I clicked move to. Well, it says I moved you to room 2, and now it's not letting me move you to room 2. So I'm going to move you to room 1.
Okay, I got a notification and it's working.
Okay, all right. Wait,
Wait,
what happened?
it hit 0 minutes and 0 seconds, so we thought we missed it.
Stink. Okay, hold on. Is it possible for you to go back to your room?
No, we'll do it. Join breakout room.
Oh yeah, join breakout room. Yeah, stay there. As that thing comes up, I'm gonna just I can control it and tell it to just keep going. So just ignore those things.
Small ones could meet, but the large ones could. So then with being more of that, because of the introduced plants, they the beak sizes would merge towards the middle because there's more of those kinds of seeds versus the larger, harder seeds. And then they also talked about like flattening the landscape to make it easier for tourists to navigate.
Okay, whoa, slow down. What kind of landscape are they talking about? This is actually why we come and learn.
Landscape.
What's that, Paula?
You ask what landscape?
Uh-huh.
They talked about rugged adaptive landscape.
Okay, what
into
do
a
they
smoother landscape.
What do they mean when they talk about an adaptive landscape?
It changes.
So that the landscape can change easily. I'm sorry.
Yeah, who else was talking? Is that Riley?
No, I think it's in the back.
No, that's me. It's my
Okay.
friend. I'm with Audrey. I'm sorry.
Oh, gotcha. So is it a physical landscape that they're talking about, or is it more of a metaphorical landscape?
Metaphorical.
Okay, Riley, what do you mean by that?
Sorry.
That's all right. Two away.
I kind of had a hard time with this, but like, I pictured it where it's like, I don't know, like I looked up what the modality meant or whatever. And I was getting a lot of like graphs where it had like two waves or whatever, and so
Two peaks. Two modes essentially.
So I like kind of pictured that as like the landscape, and whether
So
it's flattened out or not.
So on that graph, so you have some graphs in the paper, right? They look like this. Beak size is here, right? From small to large. And there's a thing like this. What's on the y-axis here?
Isn't it the number of birds?
It's the number of birds. So that thing that you see in the paper, that's not an adaptive landscape. That's just a representation of essentially how many birds had which size beaks. So it's a frequency histogram or frequency diagram showing you which beak sizes were most common. What would an adaptive landscape look like? What would be on the y-axis for an adaptive landscape? Have you seen an adaptive landscape yet in this class so far? Paula is shaking her head no. Well, I would argue you have seen an adaptive landscape. Where have you seen an adaptive landscape?
Maybe in the lab at the.
Not in lab. We've seen it in lecture.
Oh. The Coot study?
Not in the Coot study.
The
You'll slowly narrow it down. What's that?
The horned lizards.
Okay, so where in the horned lizard is the adaptive landscape?
Their horn size, maybe?
Okay, so pull up the horned lizard paper, the Young et al. Wherever you're at. I'm going to share my screen here for just a minute.
I have it here.
So can you guys see Young et al. Here?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to blow this up. Blow this up. What is this figure right here? What is this figure right here? What's on the x-axis?
When it's
That's the horn length on the x-axis.
That's horn length. And then what's on the y-axis?
Expected survival.
Expected survival. So is this a landscape?
Yes.
It's kind of a hill, isn't it? It's a hill with high fitness in one range of the phenotype and a valley of low fitness in another range of the phenotype. So adaptive landscapes are basically just these graphical representations that we have that relate the value of the phenotype to fitness. So how would we change this figure to make it an adaptive landscape?
Reduce the peaks.
No, you wouldn't do anything to the peaks. Why do these two peaks occur? You have a peak of small beak finches and a peak of large beak finches. Why are there more small beak finches and large beak finches and very few intermediate beak finches?
Because there's less accessibility to the intermediate seeds.
Okay, so if there are fewer seeds, these intermediate beak finches don't survive very well, which means that the large beak finches survive better and the small beak finches survive better than than the intermediate beak finches. So how could we change this kind of a figure into an adaptive landscape?
Would it just be changing the y-axis to which one? The survival rate?
Okay, so fitness is survival. It goes from you're alive to it goes from you're alive being a fitness of 1 to you're dead, a fitness of 0. This basically says that if you're a small beak finch, your fitness is higher than if you're an intermediate beak finch, and your fitness is higher if you are a large beak finch. And so a fitness landscape can look very much like a frequency distribution, but what changes is the y-axis. It's not the frequency of birds that fall into those categories, it's the fitness of those birds. And so this is what they mean. When they talk about then flattening this landscape, they're talking about making these peaks lower and making this valley higher. Now there aren't any fitness differences depending on beak size. There's no selection on beak size any longer, right? Does that make sense? So they're not out there bulldozing the physical landscape. They're changing the conditions that affect the survival of birds. Now, one of the questions that they'll address later on in the paper is, what exactly are the humans doing that are affecting the survival of birds as it relates to their phenotype? But the adaptive landscape is basically a visualization of the relationship between fitness and the bird's phenotype. So don't mistake that.
Yeah, I completely misinterpreted that.
Yeah, it's a common misinterpretation. The first time we taught this figure, people were talking about it like people were out there with bulldozers, like knocking down hills and stuff. And
yeah,
that's not. Yeah. So, which is why we're going through this stepwise with you, so that we get these things up front, so that you don't write about that in your final literature summary, because that would be not so good. All right, I'm going to go lurk in another room. I'm going to try and lurk in another room. How are you guys doing?
good.
What else did you have to work on?
We went through all of our questions, but I think something that like we found challenging when writing our paper was not, I wouldn't say like or just, you know, like making sure we aren't why
Plagiarizing.
can't I think of it? Plagiarizing, that's the word.
Oh, okay. And so after the first exam, we're going to talk to you guys about plagiarism. But the easiest way to avoid plagiarism is, it's a multi-step process, but the first thing you have to do is you have to understand what you're writing about. Most people, when they commit plagiarism, it's because they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And so they use the author's original wording because that's the only way that they can grapple with what it is that they're reading. And so the first step is to understand what you are reading. Once you've done that, if you really understand it, you should be able to put it in your own words. I was in another group a few minutes ago and somebody said something. I said, okay, now rephrase that in language your grandmother could understand. And he attempted to rephrase it, but he still used a lot of the jargon that was in the original wording in the paper. I'm like, okay, my grandmother doesn't have any idea what a bimodal distribution is. So rephrase it again. Your grandmother is clearly smarter than my grandmother. Rephrase it again in language that my grandmother can understand. And so a good test of your understanding of something is, can you rephrase it in commonplace language that anybody would be able to understand? And if you can do that, then you truly understand what you've read, and you can't plagiarize it because you're expressing it in language that the original authors would not have used, because they're not writing to your grandmother, they're writing to a bunch of other biologists who are very interested in evolution, probably pretty interested in Galapagos finches, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the easiest way to avoid plagiarism, is just, you know, understand the material you're reading first and then rephrase that material in commonplace language that still makes sense and is true to the original text. And we'll give you some strategies in how to do that after the first exam. We're not gonna dog you hard about plagiarism until after we've formally trained you a little bit on that. So we're gonna actually give you an exercise where we give you a passage and we ask you to write a summary of that passage. We present you with some fake examples of student writing that illustrate different mechanisms by which people plagiarize. So we're going to spend a whole 65 minutes on plagiarism, but not until after the first test. So set that aside for now. Let's talk about the science of the thing. How did you guys do on the science of the thing?
I would say overall we did pretty well as far as understanding what they were carrying out and trying to test.
Okay, so when they use the term adaptive landscape, what are they talking about?
Are they referring to like the changing landscape that humans are paving?
So now you're thinking about a physical landscape, and an adaptive landscape isn't a physical landscape. There aren't people out there with bulldozers knocking down hills and stuff like that. What do they mean when they say adaptive landscape? So here's first key to not plagiarizing. So there's this term adaptive landscape. It's going to become very clear to me. So the group that I was just in, they used the term adaptive landscape, and it made it, from the way they used the term, it made it sound like they thought people were actually like knocking down hills so that the landscape, the physical landscape of the island is flatter. And so from the way they were using the term, it made me think that's the way that they're thinking about it, but that's not actually what it is. So the first step to successfully summarizing something is making sure that you understand things. You guys don't yet understand what an adaptive landscape is, so let's get that nailed down. Somebody else take a shot at what an adaptive landscape is.
Like, are they just talking about the landscape within the species? Like the various, like, I mean, like the modes of the extremes where the different variation lies?
Okay, so we have beak size, and we have small beaks and large beaks, and we have this bimodal distribution. What's on the y-axis here?
The number of
The size.
finches.
This is size. So this is the number of birds that have small beaks, large beaks, and intermediate beaks. Is this an adaptive landscape?
I would kind of agree. I mean, yeah, there's two extremists.
It's just a frequency histogram at this point. What would you have to change about it to make it an adaptive landscape?
Like the number of
Yeah,
birds?
the numbers, yeah.
You would change number of birds to what? So you're right. It's a change to the y-axis. What does the y-axis have to be for this to be an adaptive landscape?
Well, I know in the title they were talking about the radiation.
Okay, forget that for now. That's something different.
Would it be, because I'm looking at the histograms on the paper, would it be like the separation of age and sex?
Or would it be the impact?
Have you guys witnessed, have you guys seen any adaptive landscapes in the time that you've been in this class?
I want to say yes, but I wouldn't know what it was.
Oh yeah, you have. Where do you think you've seen it?
See, I don't want to take a shot, but I don't know. I want to take a shot, but I really don't know.
I mean, we
Was
haven't
it
seen
maybe
very
like
many.
with the
I
lizards?
feel like we've seen it. Yeah.
Okay, who said the lizards? Was that Alexis?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, Alexis. So I'm going to share my screen here for just a minute. So can you guys see the horned lizard paper?
Yes.
What's on the x-axis of those figures?
Horn length.
Okay, so horn length, so some aspect of the phenotype. What is on the y-axis?
Oh, the survival rate. Or the
Expected survival rate. So you could also just say that that's some measure of fitness. So what you have here is you have a hill of fitness, of high fitness for long lizards, and short lizards experience a decline in survival or fitness such that it creates a fitness valley. So an adaptive landscape is just a visualization showing you that there are hills of high fitness for some phenotypes and valleys of low fitness for other phenotypes. That's the landscape that is being flattened. Not the hilltops, not the mountains and the volcanoes and stuff. It's this landscape that is being flattened. So here there's a hill. Here, there's a hill and a valley. And if this is fitness from 1 being alive to 0 being dead, this then represents an adaptive landscape because presumably small beaked finches have higher fitness than intermediate beaked finches, and also large beaked finches have higher fitness than intermediate beaked finches. So this is also an adaptive landscape, but in order for it to be that way, you have to change the y-axis. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to flatten this adaptive landscape, what are humans presumably doing?
They're like decreasing the variation in the species?
Well, they're not decreasing the variation of the species because to change the landscape, what do you have to be changing? How does this whole thing become flatter?
The habitat or the environment?
So what's changing in that? What's changing in the environment though?
I want to say like the more predators that are coming in type, like
Well,
maybe.
Is this about predation or is this about something else?
Well, it's about something else. Yeah.
What is it about?
It's about. Isn't it really about the population of the finches?
But why do these intermediate finches have lower fitness than large and small beaked finches?
I gotta go look at that graph.
They talk about this in the introduction. Because this is all about beak size, right? Beak size is the phenotype that they're talking about. So what's leading to declining fitness in intermediate beaked finches? What do birds do with their beaks?
In this
They build
specific
nests, eat.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Somebody said eat, right?
Yes.
Yeah, they talk about food. They talk about the availability of seeds of different sizes.
So right there it is at the beginning.
Yep, there it is at the beginning. So if you're going to change the fitness of the intermediate beaked finches, what do you have to do as a human? What are humans presumably doing?
Changing the availability of different.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're changing the availability of different size seeds such that you're either increasing the fitness of intermediate beaked finches so that it's up with the others, or you're doing something that decreases the fitness of the other two groups. But that's what it means to flatten the landscape. You're changing the fitness consequences of having a particular phenotype.
Changing the food resource.
Yeah, they're changing resource availability. So I'm going to go ahead and close all the rooms. I'll see you back in the main room.
Species. Well, think about that question. What change? And we're going to come to it as a class here in just a moment.
Yeah, I just went ahead and ended things. I felt like we were probably getting to the end of things, and I wanted to just do a common debrief.
Yeah.
So give everybody a minute to get back out. All right, if you're not here, raise your hand. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah, there. Good job. Good job. Okay, so you notice that we gave you some questions for discussion. Did those questions for discussion cover every possible thing that you needed to think about? No, they didn't. What's some things that weren't covered in those questions? This is the time you talk.
Methods.
Okay, so but the assignment today wasn't about methods, but just things in the introduction. What things in the introduction did maybe the questions just assume about you, or just for whatever reason didn't really address? I know for a fact that I talked to a couple of groups about this.
What the main bird they were focusing on for the experiment? Because they
I don't
talked about
recall.
a couple other ones too.
So they did talk about a couple other ones. I don't actually remember talking to anybody about that, but certainly that was a little distracting to me, was this whole issue of bringing the other bird species into the introduction. You could have written that introduction without including that. I recognize why they included it, but that's not what I'm actually thinking about.
The adaptive landscape.
Okay, Alexis, tell us about that. So in the questions, does it ever ask you, what is an adaptive landscape?
No.
But do you need to understand what an adaptive landscape is to understand what they're talking about in the introduction?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, in the introduction, a lot of what they're talking about is just like what human population can impact about the food resources available, and that impact on the food resources is gonna like change the landscape of the graph.
Okay, is Keaton around? Yeah, Keaton. What was your impression of what the adaptive landscape was when I bopped in on your group?
So I initially thought that it was like actually like changing the physical landscape of the island.
Okay, so now explain to us what it actually is.
So what it actually is like it would be changing the relative survival rate of all of the beak sizes rather than just the small beak and the large beak birds surviving higher than the intermediate sized beak birds.
Okay, so if somebody other than Alexis or Keaton, if you were to write a quick and easy definition of what an adaptive landscape is, what would that definition be like? An adaptive landscape is, go for it.
I guess you could say adaptive landscape is like the relativity from like their survival rate to the number of like one trait has in the population.
Okay, so that's a little disjointed, disorganized. You would be able to clean that up. But an adaptive landscape basically relates the phenotype. In this case, what's the phenotype that they're interested in? Go ahead, Grant. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Beak size.
Is it beak length?
Yeah, so in this case, it's beak size from small to large. And so what would be on the y-axis in this figure? Somebody other than Grant.
Number of birds.
That would just be a frequency histogram. Who was that?
Angelina.
Oh, Angelina. So if it's not the number of birds, what would it be?
Fitness.
Okay, so that's Riley, fitness. So it would be fitness. And remember that fitness can go from 0 to 1. At 1, you're totally fit. At 0, you're not very fit. And in this case, what has historically been the situation at Academy Bay? Who has the highest fitness?
Was it the medium?
Small beaks and large beaks.
Small beaks
The highest is small.
and large beaks. And so the fitness landscape looks kind of like the frequency histogram of the birds, but what's different about it is that it's not the number of birds that are on the y-axis, it's actually the fitness of those birds. If you have a small beak, you have high fitness. If you have a large beak, you have high fitness. If you have an intermediate beak, you have low fitness. Somebody in a group that I didn't talk to, where have you seen a graph that relates the fitness of individuals to their phenotype? Nathan's like, yeah, that's the question I've been dying to ask. Where have you seen a figure like this before? It doesn't take the same shape, but it still relates fitness to phenotype.
The lizards that we studied?
The horn lizards. Yep, the horn lizards. So go back and look at Young et al. Figure C and D in the Young et al. Paper, those are fitness landscapes. You have a hill of high fitness for long horned lizards, and a valley of low fitness for short-horned lizards relative to head size, overall head size.
If you read the text, I believe that, just so you know, they call it a fitness surface in the Young et al. Paper. It's the same thing.
They call it a selection surface. Yeah, but yeah, it's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. And when you look at the figure, you'll see that on the y-axis is expected survival, which is one way of measuring fitness. So you need to get that in your head. The first time that we assigned this reading to students, when we read the literature summaries, it was clear that they thought that people were out there bulldozing down hills and things like this with actual like earth moving equipment. And one of a variety of reasons that we started instituting this stepwise process of going through and reading the paper and writing drafts of, for example, the introduction. So the questions don't necessarily ask you about the adaptive landscape, but if you don't know something about an adaptive landscape, it becomes a little bit difficult to understand what they're getting at in the introduction, doesn't it? So who wants to take a shot at giving us the kind of big picture question that they're interested in, that Hendry et al. Are interested in?
They were mostly focused on the diversity of the finches on the island because of the growth of human population on that island, correct?
And what do they think is happening to those populations of finches on the island as a result of these humans being around?
A reduction in diversity.
Okay, so a reduction in diversity, is that because they're driving species extinct? Joseph, you're shaking your head no.
Because they are affecting the population in many ways. One of the examples we talked about was like a Curus population. If they're feeding the finches, you know, something that's not in their normal diet, that would change the mode and it would become a uniform distribution.
Okay, so if they're doing something that provides intermediate sized food to the finches, those intermediate sized finches that are at low fitness now would have higher fitness. And so this population that has been diverging possibly into two new species will stop diverging and come back together. And actually talk about it in the paper as coming back together, which I thought was a very weird, even my grandmother would understand way of talking about it. Why this island? Why these populations?
Because
go ahead,
somebody.
Connor.
Oh, who's that? Is that Connor?
Yeah, on I believe it was one of the Galapagos Islands. This island had a great number of species of finches, unlike other places.
Well, so you have these finches in particular, but a number of these finch species actually occur on other Galapagos Islands. Somebody else.
This was the only place where there was a great diversity of finches and a quickly increasing human population.
Okay, so this is the only place where you have these finches that have these bimodal distributions of phenotype at the same place where you have a population of human beings that are increasing. If you don't have any humans around, then you should probably just expect nothing to change. What's the other advantage of doing this there?
They also have two other sites on that island that doesn't really have the direct impact. There are no people living on that two sides, so only grazing.
Okay, so you have a population of humans that are really spatially aggregated and they're not spread throughout the island. They just occur in this one place because they only have the one place where the humans are. They then have other places on the island to compare to where the humans are. What else? Nathan?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's another thing that makes this a good system. I know one of the groups that I was in nailed it.
there's a lot of other research from other people like Darwin on the finches that were living on the island.
Yeah. So was Andrew Hendry in the Galapagos Islands back in the 1940s gathering birds and taking their beak measurements?
No.
No, he would be really old now if he was back there doing that. And he's not young, but he's not that old. And so the other advantage that you have is you have all of this other data that other people have gathered for you that you can use and look at what's going on now and add your little bit of data to this long record of data and then see how this has changed over long periods of time, decades worth of time, actually. All right, we're almost out of time. Nathan, do you have anything you want to add here at the end?
Yeah, I have two things. First, I want you all to be careful with some of the terminology you're using. I know a lot of this is new, but two terms that I think you want to be able to think clearly about are variation in beak size and the shape of that distribution within a single species versus the diversity of finches. Remember, as we talked about in our small groups, this paper focuses on one species. So they're interested in the variation in beak size. Try to avoid saying the diversity of beak size because that could trip you up into thinking about the diversity of finches, which is the context. You know, they worked here because finches are diversifying, presumably, or have been, but it's the variation in beak size that's going to matter here.
Yeah, and the introduction makes it a little confusing because they talk about 3 different species of finches, but they're only studying variation within one species of finch, Geospiza fortis.
The other thing that I want to let you know is I posted a preparation homework on Moodle. So do that preparation homework before class on Wednesday.
Okay, I have one last question. Do you feel like this required quite a lot of thought on your part getting through this session? So thought beforehand, what about thought during the moment while you're in class? Okay, are you guys feeling okay with that? I know it can be a little uncomfortable at the beginning having to think on the fly as you're going through this. You guys hanging? Okay, all right. Do your homework that Dr. Judd has for you and we'll see you on Wednesday. All right.